Welcome to another exciting day in AP Bio. So today what I want to do is it's more like a review of the diversity of life on Earth, starting with the prokaryotes and ending with the animals on the very top. And it's more of a review of how we are organized and trying to bring to your attention some important details regarding adaptations or sequence, how organisms show up here on Earth. Again, remember, since I'm going to start from the very beginning with the prokaryotic type of cells, that is basically bacteria and archaeobacteria. And remember that it's going to be useful if you have this little chart that kind of shows you the process when things evolved or show up in the fossil record. That's the evidence that we have that these things have happened in this particular way. We're not making it up. We just find the fossils, figure out their age, and use that information to document the timing of events. Of course, you know now we are also using a lot of molecular data, but here we go. I want to give you a pretty good idea of the diversity, and a lot of this is going to be a review for most of you that when you were in freshman bio, we covered many of these things. Couple of little short 1-minute videos there if you want to watch them at some point. Always fun to watch. So we're going to start with an overview of the 6 kingdoms. As you know, the 6 kingdoms have been organized now in 3 domains based on the molecular data. We discussed that when we did the cladograms, that based on molecular data, we have 3 big groups based on the sequences of our DNA, and we are quite different, more different at the DNA level than at the morphological level. So we have the domain bacteria, the domain archaea, and then we have the domain eukarya that includes all the 4 kingdoms that you're familiar with. So starting with prokaryotes, you know, in general, so here I'm gonna, well, let me back up for a second, since we're not gonna do this again. Please remember that we have bacteria. These are the most common bacteria that we have. These are the archaeobacteria. These are the ones that live in extreme environments for the most part, and includes the bacteria that live in very hot springs, places very salty, like the Dead Sea, Salt Lake, places without any oxygen, very extreme conditions, and some of them produce methane, and we have some of those actually in our intestine. So extreme environments, very hot, very cold, very poor conditions, they are there. And this is the kingdom with most of the ones that we see every day. These are the ones that live in our skin, our nose, armpits. I hope you read that article about bacteria that I gave you from National Geographic. It will help to refresh your mind about how important these creatures are. So I'm gonna go in general about prokaryotic cells. So this includes the 2 types of bacteria, regular and archaeobacteria. Just remember that they have, the main difference is the type of DNA, circular versus linear DNA when you're talking about eukarya. This just to dispel that image of when we draw DNA in bacteria, we make a little loop here and there. But this is actually a lot of DNA in bacteria. This is a bacteria cell, E. coli, and that basically was placed in a hypotonic solution and blew up, basically. And this is the bacterial chromosome. If it's all done correctly and you follow all these loops around, it's going to be a perfect circle. So a lot of DNA in real life. Now I want to bring to your attention here we have 2 typical bacteria. These are free living. Ignore the colors because they screwed up the color pattern. Now these 2 pictures are in your textbook, and probably from here you're not going to see it. This is a cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria, this is a photosynthetic bacteria. It's called cyano. Cyano means blue because it looks kind of blue-greenish. Another name for this, unfortunately, is blue-green algae. And I say unfortunately because we usually, when we talk about algae, we are talking about protists, unicellular protists that do photosynthesis. So it's kind of a misfortune that these guys are called blue-green algae, but the blue should cue you in that this is a bacteria. It's really what we call cyanobacteria. Now, if you look at this, I say here that these are photosynthetic organisms. That means that they have to have chlorophyll, not chloroplast, because chloroplast is a membrane-bound organelle. So they have to have chlorophyll, and in this case, the chlorophyll, if you look at this picture in your textbook or someplace where you can see it more clearly, in this electron micrograph, you're going to see lines here, and those lines are basically membranes. So they have a significant amount of membranes inside the cell, and in these membranes is where you find the chlorophyll. The chlorophyll is in the membranes. Just like if you recall the chloroplast, let's do a quick, if you have a chloroplast, that's plants, eukaryotes, the chloroplast is made out of thylakoids. And if you recall from photosynthesis, when we covered photosynthesis, in the membrane of these thylakoids is what we call the photosystem 2, and then over here is located the photosystem 1, and in these photosystems you have the molecule of chlorophyll plus another electron acceptors there. And these are located in the membrane of the thylakoid. So basically, here the chlorophyll is in the membrane of the thylakoids. So if we go back to here, where is the chlorophyll? Again, the chlorophyll here is located in the membrane of these internal membranes of these bacteria. So they are able to do photosynthesis great. So this is a photosynthetic bacterium. Also among the bacteria we have this other type. Again, if you ignore the green color, if you look closely here, these are membranes, membranes, membranes. And these are, let me change color. These are aerobic bacteria. That means to be aerobic, they can use oxygen. Remember that the oxygen part when we do cellular respiration only comes when they enter the mitochondria and they go to the electron transport chain that is in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So, and this electron transport chain that in regular eukaryotic organisms is in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, in these prokaryotic cells, all those proteins basically and enzymes needed to transport electrons, to pass them on to oxygen, to produce a large number of ATP are right here in these membranes. Please don't forget that in these membranes, also besides the electron transport chain and besides the chlorophyll, that's also where we have ATP synthase. Yep. Switch the letter, synthase. Right? So basically, even though bacteria do not have compartments, they have the capacity to do all these more highly advanced metabolic processes because they have whatever they need inside the membranes. And they have membranes inside. Now, these membranes are not organized into compartments, they are just layers of membranes, but they have them. Now, if you, all these internal membranes for photosynthesis basically are what become a chloroplast, and these internal membranes here used for for aerobic respiration is what later will become a mitochondria through the process of endosymbiosis. Remember that these are free-living bacteria that at some point are going to become phagocytized by another cell, and they are going to remain there in a mutualistic relationship. Keeping on with the theme of prokaryotes, just remember that some prokaryotes, in addition to the cytoplasm, cell membrane, cell wall, they also have this capsule, and the capsule is an extra protection level that, as you know, remember the smooth and rough bacteria that we studied during DNA. The smooth and the rough is basically the presence or the absence of the capsule. If you have a capsule, your immune system has a hard time killing them because they are heavily protected. How do bacteria get their energy they need? Again, it's a highly variable process, and some of them are photoautotrophs. That means that they can do photosynthesis, and using light energy, they can get all the energy that they need to produce organic molecules. Those are the photosynthetic bacteria. You also have, among the bacteria, a group that we call chemoautotrophs. Notice that they are autotrophs. That means that they can make their own complex organic compounds. But to make these complex organic compounds, you need to have a source of energy. And the source of energy comes from the oxidation of inorganic compounds that they find in the places where they live. And the clear example of these chemoautotroph bacteria are the ones that you find in hydrothermal vents in the mid-oceanic regions, mainly along the middle of the Atlantic and a couple of places in the Pacific. So they make their own food is using either light or the oxidation of some organic compounds. And then, of course, you have the heterotrophs. Basically, they have to get their organic compounds from other organisms or from the environment. So some are free living, or some, like we know, are living other organisms and use the other organisms as a source of their compounds. So 3 different ways of metabolism, regardless of which one. The basic mechanism to break down glucose, the main source of energy, is always glycolysis in all of them. And from then on, you can get more complex or less complex, but glycolysis is a standard mechanism for most of these organisms. I want also to make sure that you remember that most bacteria are actually pretty good, that we just think that they are bad because they cause some problems. But please remember that between bacteria and fungi, they're in charge of decomposing, basically breaking down all the waste products, dead organisms, into basically basic monomers and basic elements so they can be reused. Please remember that bacteria in the soil, a specific group, can do what is called nitrogen fixation. That means they can grab nitrogen gas from the air. 78% of the air is nitrogen gas that nobody can use. We need it for proteins and nucleic acids, but nobody can use it except for these bacteria that can use it, grab that nitrogen gas, and transform it into other compounds that plants actually can use. So they are the only ones that can transform this nitrogen gas into nitrates mostly and ammonia, 2 compounds that plant cells can use in the ground. Again, remember that we owe to bacteria the ability for these little ruminants, all the major herbivores, the capacity to digest what they eat. Remember that E. coli and a number of other bacteria are the ones that have the enzymes needed for them to digest the cell walls of plants. Also, E. coli in us, remember they are the ones that make vitamin K and B12 in our large intestine, as we mentioned when we did digestive system. And finally, let's be thankful to bacteria because they are the ones that make some of the foods that we like yogurt, sour cream, kimchi, pickles, those kind of things. And also, in this day and age, bacteria are making a lot of our medications through genetic engineering. So I hope that helps you get a better understanding of prokaryotes. You can stop now, do whatever, but I'm gonna keep on going through all the six kingdoms that we have here to give you a big picture of everything. So bacteria in general, prokaryotic cells, 2 kingdoms, 2 domains, because the the molecular data tells us that their DNAs are very totally different. Now, for a long time, those were the only creatures on Earth. Then after that, through the process of endosymbiosis and the increase in membrane structure, we can see that in the process of life on Earth, and also the ability to produce oxygen, we have now what we call real eukaryotic cells that show up about 2 billion years ago. So these first eukaryotic cells are what we call in the kingdom Protista. Now Protista is a funny kingdom with high diversity of organisms. It's not a monophyletic group, now that you know what that is, and is in the process of being revised and redone. So in a few years from now, instead of kingdom Protista, we are going to have a number of other kingdoms. So when you have children in high school, you're going to have to relearn all this all over again. So what's the classification criteria to put something in the kingdom Protista? Basically, it's not an animal, plant, or fungi. Well, and of course, has to have eukaryotic cells. So if you are not one of those three, you are dumped in the kingdom Protista, and that's what I said is in the process of being revised. So the Protista include all the unicellular organisms that we are familiar with, from amoeba, paramecium, euglena, plasmodium, the one that causes sickle cell anemia, not sickle cell, the one that gives the heterozygous advantage to individuals with sickle cell anemia. So unicellular organisms, but also includes what we call seaweed. And this is the part that is not quite right, but from the classification point of view, right now it's there, but they're going to be reassessed and redone in the future. Now remember that the origin of eukaryotic cells comes from basically prokaryotic cells. The ancestral eukaryotic cell was kind of a prokaryotic cell with an increased number of membranes, as I showed you before. We even see that today, that there is high variability in the amount of membranes inside the cells. And then through the process of phagocytosis, they phagocytize an aerobic, free-living bacteria that became later on a mitochondria. And the process could continue phagocytizing a photosynthetic free-living bacteria that became a chloroplast. And lines of evidence for that, remember the size of these organelles is pretty much the size of a bacteria. These organelles divide and do their own thing, and they are free. They move independently of everything else in the cell. They are not bound to the cytoskeleton or anything. They have their own lives inside. They have their own DNA. They have their own ribosomes. And both DNA and ribosomes are totally different from the eukaryotic ones. They are identical technically to the bacteria type. So plenty of evidence to support that. And please remember the person that proposed this theory and now has been, the evidence keeps on amounting every day, was Miss Lynn Margulis. Now, to show you that this is not like a made-up scenario that phagocytosis and then the stuff never gets digested and survives there, I want to show you, here you have a paramecium, and I think these pictures are also in your textbook, so when you read it, you're going to see them clearly. You have a nice paramecium, you're familiar with them, they are heterotroph, they're always hunting around and eating smaller creatures. And right here I want to show you, this is another type of Protista, it's called chlorella, and it's a basically photosynthetic Protista, it's an algae. And they're very small. This is the real size of them. So these are very small, this guy is very large. And this last picture that I have here, again in your textbook is going to be much nicer. If you look carefully, is paramecium, and inside is packed with chlorella. Basically, phagocytized all these chlorellas and didn't digest them. So what does this become? Pretty much the same as here. You phagocytize them and you never eat them. Now, what is this paramecium able to do now? This paramecium doesn't need to go hunting and eating other creatures. It just needs to hang someplace in the water where it can have light, because then the chlorella will do all the work for the paramecium. Ah, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And we see that today. I might even have some in my tank doing that. Now, I told you that when you have the protista that do photosynthesis, the unicellular protista that do photosynthesis, we tend to call those algae. And this algae is what makes pretty much most of a significant part of the phytoplankton on Earth. And I just love this picture, so I want to show it to you. This is Ireland, the country, the island of Ireland. The stuff around is the ocean, and you can see clearly this more greener section of the ocean. That's a bloom of phytoplankton, just an algae bloom basically. Heavy amounts of phytoplankton there, and of course when you have this, you have small fishes eating the phytoplankton, and bigger fishes, and you have the perfect fishing ground there. This is actually what those scouting airplanes do for the fishing boats. They go find phytoplankton blooms, because that means that's where the fishes are gonna be. Anyway, beautiful. The white stuff, for the record, those are clouds, because this is a satellite image. So that was protista. Remember, unicellular, could be autotroph, heterotroph, parasites, huge variety, includes also seaweed. And they are the first, they evolved around 2 billion years ago is when we see the first eukaryotic cells that were kind of basically our early protists. So from then on, we have these cells start forming colonies, and from the colonies they start organizing, and we have cell differentiation, and they start becoming more complex structures, and they are actually the ones that give origin to the 3 remaining kingdoms: fungi, plants, and animals. Now, up to now, all this has been happening in water. And all this has been happening in water. As you can see, everything lives pretty much in the water. For fungi, I just want to, a quick thing, because there's a very important concept. Remember that fungi have their bodies made out of mycelium or hypha. Remember the hypha. And here is a nice toast of bread, or piece of bread, with mold. And remember, sometimes some of us I used to, just mold in that corner. I used to remove that section of mold from the corner and say, that's all we need. Just remove that section of mold. Look at that picture clearly. You see the hypha going underground all over the bread. So even if you don't see it, the mold is everywhere. So let's do a quick view of fungi to remind you of a few things. Remember, these are eukaryotes, of course. They are heterotrophs, all of them, heterotrophs, and they feed by absorption. Remember, they have their hypha, they spread around, and whatever they touch, let's find something touchable. Whatever they touch, their hypha release the enzymes to the outside, and the enzymes break down all the organic compounds into the basic monomers, glucose, amino acids. And when those things are broken down into the basic monomers, then they absorb them back into the hypha, and then they get distributed to the whole body. So they have like an external digestion system, and that's why they are so good at decomposing everything, because they secrete enzymes everywhere. Now, so mostly multicellular. The only exceptions are yeast that are unicellular. And remember, they have a cell wall, and the cell wall is not like cellulose in plants, it's chitin. It's another polysaccharide, and chitin is also present in the exoskeleton of insects. Very interesting. Now, we saw fungi when we did our lab on meiosis and recombination. We used Sordaria, that fungus, and you were counting spores, the dark and the clear spores. So here we have mycelium, different pictures, you saw that. We remember seeing that too, and remember, these are underground. These are the ones that are actually breaking down organic compounds in the ground. And the only time that you really see the structure above ground is when they are gonna reproduce. and most of these reproduce producing spores. So, talking about reproduction, here we have our beautiful yeast, the same yeast that we use to make bread and alcoholic beverages like wine and beer. Notice that they can reproduce asexually by the process of budding. They produce a little bud that eventually breaks out. But they also can reproduce sexually. Remember, these have linear chromosomes now. So they do meiosis, actually. They do meiosis. And here you have the ones that we used in the lab. Remember the hypha of the tan and the black spores joining together and fusing their genomes together. So asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction present in fungi. And they have linear chromosomes like us. Beautiful picture summarizing two of the major groups that we have studied. Fungi, this is Penicillium notatum. This is the penicillium, one of the penicillium that makes penicillin, the compound that kills bacteria. And here you're familiar with this, is a petri dish, is a plate with agar with a lot of bacteria. And notice what happens here in this zone. All the bacteria there are dead because the fungus produce this compound that we call penicillin that basically killed the bacteria, prevent the formation of cell wall, and then they just blow up. Fantastic. Good, so we have two things left, and they are going to be the most interesting ones because you can see these more often, you know where they are. So we're going to start with plants, and for plants I'm not going to drill you on plants, we'll try to do that another time, but I hope that you are familiar with the basic plant groups. So, who were the first plants? Remember, plants, eukaryotic cells, they have chloroplasts, they do photosynthesis. So for 3 billion years on Earth, there was nothing on land. Nothing. Because life evolved in the oceans. So water, critical element for all of us. So the first eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms, again, were in the water, and they were, or they are, what we these days call green, notice, not blue-green, just green algae. Basically protists that can do photosynthesis and that make most of the phytoplankton. You don't need to know this. The group that basically started it all as plants is a group of protists in between called Caryophysians. You don't need to worry about that, just to throw a name at you. So here are diversity of protists, and from this is what we know now that plants evolved. So you are in the water. So imagine all these creatures are in the water, and this is kind of the type of primitive protist, kind of similar. This is the Caryophysians. It's kind of a colony. All the cells organized. They can do photosynthesis. So they were aquatic. And please think of plants in an aquatic environment. All right. Now, you are aquatic. Now I want you to think, why would be advantageous for plants to move and colonize the earth? And we are talking about colonization of land by plants around 480 million years ago. So advantages of moving to land. And remember, plants don't just say, okay, let's move to land. You know, there is high variation in plants. Conditions favor some. Of all the ones that landed on land, most of them probably disappear, and natural selection through variation over millions of years allowed a few of them that had the right adaptations to survive. So please, we do everything very fast here for practical purposes, but in reality you have to put the time frame that all this happens over millions of years. So, advantages. All at once, right there. Basically, if you are on land, you have more sunlight available to do photosynthesis. The light is not going to be filtered by the water. A lot more sunlight. And that increases the rate of photosynthesis, more energy. Also, on land, you're going to have more CO2. Remember that gases have to dissolve in the water first, and there is less gas in the water than is in the true atmosphere. So here we go. We have more sun. We have more CO2. Soil. What is the soil made out of? Soil is made out of broken rocks. Weathering and erosion weathering breaks the rocks. Erosion moves those grains of the product of breaking the rocks, and that's what soil is, basically broken down rocks. And as you know well, rocks are made out of a humongous mix of minerals. So for our dear plants, the soil now that they have here on land has enormous amounts of the things that they need a lot. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, iron, magnesium. Magnesium, you need that for photosynthesis to make chlorophyll. So much more rich, much more concentrated here than in the ocean. Remember the size of the ocean. So even if we have weathering and erosion on land and all this washes out into the ocean, all these minerals have to be dissolved in this humongous volume of water. If you are on land, you land in a patch and everything is right there. It's not diluted by this humongous ocean. Finally, hey, you come here and there are no predators at all. So great advantages. So those that were able to think of these plants in the edge of the water, you know, where the waves break, the water goes out and they sit there in the, if they have what it takes to survive there, they might be able to resist and survive on land and keep propagating and increase their reproductive success compared to the ones that are totally submerged. So it's a step-by-step process. Now, what the problems of moving to land? You know, there's never everything is quite straight here. Problems of moving to land, mainly if you are a plant, and it's going to be pretty much the same for animals when they start colonizing land. Problem number one, inland you don't have water. Up to this time, they've been submerging water, never had to deal with the problem of preventing water loss or how to get their water or how to move their sperm and eggs around, because they just throw everything there and there it goes. Now, if you are on land, all these great things are available to you, but you have to pay a price. And the price is that you don't have water everywhere. So you have to be able to figure out how you're going to prevent yourself from drying up, basically. That's problem number one. You're going to dry up. Problem number two. In the water, everybody floats, no matter what you are. What happens when you are a plant, it's like the ones in the water, and you try to put them on land? Plop! They flop because gravity. They don't have a support system because in the water, their buoyancy is neutral. So big problems that they have to face on land. So in general, moving to land requires plant organisms to deal with two major adaptations. Adaptations dealing with the water loss and reproduction. Because remember that up to here, they just threw their sperm and eggs into the water and everybody was happy. Now, they don't have water all around. So how are they going to reproduce since plants don't walk around? So, what are this evolution of land plants? So, the process started about 500 million years ago. Fossils of true land plants, we find them around 480 million years. So it took 20 or 30 million years to kind of get the process going. So, adaptations for life on land. How do they prevent losing water? Basically, developing the cuticle is great adaptation. A waxy cuticle that makes you impermeable to water, great adaptation. Second, since you still need to exchange gases and you have that waxy cover all around, you have to have openings to allow the oxygen and CO2, oxygen out, CO2 in. Remember, That was one of the great advantages, that you have more gases. So they had to develop, or any openings that were there got selected for and became the stomata. And remember that most stomata are located in the underside of the leaf, because that minimizes the amount of water loss due to high temperatures. Also, now all the nutrients, I don't like that word, but all the inorganic compounds, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, iron, magnesium, they are in the ground now. The water is in the ground. How are they going to get these things to the rest of the plant? When they lived in the water, everything was all over, so they didn't need any structures to carry. They didn't need a pipe system. What do they need now? Since everything is in one place and they need to take it. They needed to evolve basically a transport system. And basically, if we have time, we'll look into this. These are cells that are already there. So when these cells die, particularly the xylem, cells die and leave a hollow cavity, and water by capillarity and other processes is able to move through. So it didn't require reinventing the wheel, just basically some dead cells did the job. So, cuticle to prevent desiccation, stomata to allow for the exchange of gases, xylem and phloem to allow for the transport, and of course, in order to sustain gravity, the thickening of the cell walls with cellulose was one of the other important adaptations. Cell walls with increased thickness of cellulose. Finally, to protect the embryo, remember we are always trying to protect our babies, and to protect the embryo from desiccation and to make sure that the embryo has everything, is the production of seeds. And seeds have that thick coat, the seed coat that we are familiar with, outside, and the embryo is actually inside. Beautiful process, allows organisms to survive on land, and this is what plants needed to make it. And remember, what we see today are the ones that were the best at this and survived. We don't get to see really the ones that didn't make it. So plant diversity, let's round it up before we almost there. I hope you know the basic groups of plants that include mosses, ferns, all the gymnosperms, basically what we call Christmas trees, pines and firs and spruces, and then what we call flowering plants, that are most of the plants, most of the trees that we have, at least in this area. So they are all kind of in a nice phylogenetic tree here. So we have the ancestral protists that colonized land, and the very first plants that evolved actually were mosses. They are very small, as you know, mosses. They are non-vascular. They didn't have phloem and xylem yet. And they always have to live still in places near the water. So that gives you a clue that that was kind of the very first one. If we have time, I'll go into more details of the beautiful adaptations that these mosses have. But for now, mosses were the very first ones, and so primitive still that they didn't have a vascular system. Then the major next evolutionary step, so first group here, next evolutionary step is the evolution of a vascular system for movement of water and sugars, and that's xylem and phloem. Xylem for water, moves from bottom up. Phloem can go either way. And the first group that evolved from that dominated the earth for millions and millions of years, are the ferns. Now, here we have a vascular system, but no seeds yet. No seeds. So their embryos are very vulnerable to the environmental conditions. So what happened next? Next major advantage, pollen and seeds. And here I should say something about reproduction, really. These guys, to fertilize each other, they have sperm that still swims. They have swimming sperm. So in order to have sex, to reproduce, they need to have water around. That's why you also find ferns and mosses usually in places that are very moist, because they need water to allow that sperm to swim from one place to another. Now, here, instead of needing water for the sperm to swim, they develop a flying sperm, pollen. Basically, you go from an Aquaman sperm to a Superman sperm that now can fly and be independent of the presence of water for reproduction. Awesome. So, major evolutionary advantages here, that the new traits that evolve, basically the production of pollen and seeds, basically an embryo protected in this structure that has a seed coat and has a storage of nutrients inside. So here we go with the gymnosperms. Those are our conifers in general. They have naked seeds. You don't have to worry too much about it. And usually cylindrical, just needle-like leaves. And then the major, more successful group at the present time is the angiosperms that have flowers. Remember, these guys don't have flowers, they have cones. They have flowers, and this is the dominant group right now. In the past, ferns were dominant. Then there was a time when gymnosperms dominated the earth. And now the most abundant dominant group are the angiosperms, except that these guys don't do very well in colder places. These guys still do very well in colder places. Think of Canada and the taiga, that's where you find these ones. So I hope this kind of helps you understand the evolution of plants. So we start first plant, second group, third group, and the newer group of plants is this one. So I just want to show you this because this is fascinating. These are ferns actually, and this is what Earth looked like around 300 million years ago. These are gigantic ferns with gigantic insects, and they, of course, since they need so much water, this was kind of swampy area always. And this is what West Virginia looked like. Very warm, very swampy, full of ferns. When these ferns die, they go into the water, they start kind of rotting, decomposing like in a swamp, nasty. When that swamp dries up and gets covered, that becomes coal. Pure coal. So that's why West Virginia now, and parts of Virginia and Pennsylvania, is coal. 300 million years ago, during the Carboniferous period, they were swamps packed with gigantic fern trees, and that's where our coal comes from. Carboniferous period, if you know any Spanish, Carboniferous, carbon, that's where the name comes from. Carbon, coal. All right, perfect. Fossil fuels, get it? Coal, fossil fuels, yeah. All right, I hope that kind of spiked a little bit of interest in plants. I find plants the most fascinating groups, and people usually ignore them until they start getting to know them more personally. So that brings us to the last group, the animals. And I'm not going to bore you with too many details here. This is what you know the best. But in general, remember that animals, we are heterotroph, have to eat other things. We are multicellular, no cell walls. Now, something unique to animals is the presence of collagen. Collagen is the protein that connects our cells and keeps them springy and nice, except when you get old and your collagen is not there anymore and everything just sags and hangs. But this is a beautiful protein that is only present in animals. Think about it. It's a protein that you only have in animals. That's what holds our bodies together in part. Also unique to animals, we have a nervous and muscle tissue. We are the only ones with nerves and muscles. That's another amazing thing that we have, unique to animals. And please remember that when you get to animals, we're the only ones that do this too, and we saw this before. So it's kind of a review. You have your zygote. You start the cleavage process where the zygotes start dividing. Divide, the cells get smaller because this is fast, and the zygote to begin is huge. So you have the blastula stage. Remember, the blastula stage is hollow inside, and these are potential cells. They can become almost anything. And here you have, when you get this process going, you have the invagination there. That process is called gastrulation, and that's the beginning of the rest of development. So just remember this, we discussed this, that these are totally undifferentiated cells. All your genes are technically available. As differentiation progresses, a lot of your genes turn off and you become more programmed to do something. What else is unique to animals? We have larval stages for development, and all organisms have at least some type of larval stage. And remember that many organisms go through what we call metamorphosis. Not only arthropods, there are many other creatures that go through that process. That is a drastic change in morphology. The other beautiful thing is that all animals, and only animals, and nothing but animals, have the fascinating Hox genes, homeotic genes. Remember that these are the genes that regulate development. That those are the master regulatory genes of development. That one gene regulates everything that down the line that has to do with formation of vertebra or formation of your limbs or how many segments in your body. So any change that happens to these master regulatory genes can completely change your morphology. And you don't need humongous change. You need just a little mutation in one of these master regulatory genes, and it's going to have significant impact down the road. Because remember, the job of the Hox genes is that one gene here, if this is my Hox gene, is going to basically be like transcription factors to activate a number of other genes. Now, if there is a change in this Hox gene here, and some of these don't work anymore, what you are going to see is a drastic change in morphology. So, changes in body plans in animals actually are extremely easy to come by, as has been demonstrated by experimental work in the lab, that you mutate Hox genes or you turn them off and you see very interesting things happening in development. Where do animals come from? Again, from one of these proteus-like creatures. Proteus. First, do you recognize this? This is kind of the first levels of development. We have actually protists this day that do this kind of thing. And they crawl like little blobs like this on the bottom of the ocean. So it's like, hey, we still have them around. So this is a group called the choanoflagellates, and there are some things very similar to this that we still kind of have around today. Remember, animals have their big blowout when they show up in about 30 or 40 million years, had what we call the Cambrian Explosion. That's when most animal groups evolved, about 140 million years ago. And nobody kind of has the definite answer of what caused this Cambrian explosion, basically explosion in the diversity of animals. But there are three hypotheses that are pretty good working hypotheses about what caused this diversity. And one is the evolution of predator-prey systems. As you become bigger and become more mobile, you're not just floating there waiting for something to hit you that you can eat. You can actually get places, and if you get places you get to eat more, but then the things that can escape you. So it changes the dynamic. It's a new set of interactions there. So when these evolve with bigger organisms, more autonomous, you have predator-prey interactions, increases the chances of interactions and natural selection, indeed. The other factor is, remember, oxygen starts accumulating in the atmosphere about 2 billion years ago. That's 1.5 billion before this, and it's a slow process that starts accumulating. Now, with the increase in oxygen, remember, if you have more oxygen, you can do more aerobic respiration. That increases the amount of energy. Those that are aerobic can move faster and get things done faster. As you move faster, everything snowballs and can go faster. So it is thought that also the increase in oxygen concentration in the atmosphere and the increase in metabolic rates speeded up this process of natural selection and ability to change faster. And finally, the last one, by studying the Hox genes in different groups and using the molecular clocks and all those little things that I have talked to you, they think that this high diversity of animals that happen is in part due to the evolution of Hox genes. Remember, only animals have these Hox genes that are master regulatory genes for development. So if you increase the rate of mutation in this, you can change morphology much faster because one gene affects many genes involved in development. So I want to introduce you finally, and I just have a few minutes left here, so be patient. To chordates, we go through all the invertebrate groups, and we get to chordates, that is the group that evolved the last, and that's where we are. And if you are a vertebrate, I want you to realize the sequence, how we evolved: fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Birds and mammals kind of at the same time coming out. And if you're a chordate, you have a couple of things. You have a tail, you have the gills, gill pouches that actually as an adult are gonna become eustachian tubes, and we have those. And ask me about an eustachian tube and I'll show you where you have it. Also, if you're a chordate, you have a brain with a spinal cord, very convenient. So we have all this stuff. All chordates have the same structures, and that's what makes us all chordates. Fishes were the first ones, and fishes evolved in the ocean like everything else. So then we have the transition of animals to land. Just like in plants, we have some issues. So here we have the transition to land, evolution of tetrapods. Tetrapods means 4 legs. And we have this evidence, do you remember seeing that the limbs of all vertebrates have all the same bones, just arranged differently in different proportions? This is a primitive lobed fin fish. They have fins, but if you look at the base of the fins, they actually have the same bones that we have, much smaller. Early amphibians, this is kind of what they look like, and their bones basically just a little bit bigger than that, and these other ones got reduced. And they found what we call the transition form, a gorgeous fossil, Tiktaalik. This is Tiktaalik, and as you can see, it's kind of like a crocodile, kind of fish, kind of has the fins, so it's a kind of a fish that could kind of swim a little bit or scoot a little bit on land. This was found in Canada, so that's the place, and this is Canadian name, one of the native people's names there. They named it Tiktaalik, and it's our transitional fossil between fishes and true amphibians. Beautiful, gorgeous creature. So, let's finish up. So, from fish to mammals. So, I want you to think again, we are moving to land. What are the problems with moving to land? If you're a fish, you live and reproduce in the water, you are okay. Now, when you try to move to land, and remember, it's not like, okay, let's move to land. There are some advantages to being on land, and the first advantage, like always, was the lack of predators. More oxygen in land than in water. So again, there are some advantages. Now, if you are the first group that you are an amphibian, remember amphibians can live in water and land. That's what amphi both means. They are able to have two lives, in water and land. What's the problem with amphibians? They live in land, they can hop around, think of frogs, toads, but when the time comes for reproducing, where do they have to go? They have to go back to the water and lay their eggs in the water, in those masses of eggs. And they have to reproduce in the water because their eggs are just a gelatinous mass. If they lay them on the land, they are dead. So they are able to hop around because their skin is thicker to prevent a little bit of water loss, but they always have to be in moist places for the most part. So then we have the reptile group, and the reptiles are more successful at colonizing land and anywhere on land. They are not bound to water anymore. They can live independent of water. Why? First, to live on land, they develop scales, and scales makes their bodies waterproof, so they prevent water loss. Awesome. They are not desiccated anymore. Then comes the time to reproduce, and when you lay the egg, you need to provide your babies with, your embryos with water, so they don't dry up. So what's the solution? Instead of going to find a pond or some puddle of water, basically they encase their egg in a shell, and inside this shell they put water. And that water is what we call the amnios. And if you look here, or amnion, this is an egg, this is the shell, this is the yolk, the yellow part. Here is a developing embryo, but surrounding, notice that the embryo is in a special sac, this bluish thing, and inside this sac there is water. Water. That's called the amnion. So you have your food, your supply of water there, and a bunch of other stuff there to help you survive. That's an amniotic egg. Now, you don't need to go back to the water. You can lay this egg anywhere you want to, and your babies are gonna make it. What happens next? So we are done with your amphibians, our reptiles that have those beautiful scales to prevent desiccation, and they have the amniotic egg. Well, then comes the birds. That's the next step. And you know, the birds evolved from a group of reptiles. They live on land for the most part. They also have scales. If not, look at the legs of a chicken or any bird. They all have scales in their legs. But also they have keratinized skin. And the feathers, guess what? Feathers are pure keratin, pretty much, a protein. And it's going to prevent desiccation. Now, to reproduce, how do they do it? Pretty much like reptiles. They have an amniotic egg. The only difference is that the shell is much harder and is made out of calcium carbonate. In birds, it's calcium carbonate. So guess what? All birds have to have a good source of calcium around to be able to lay enough eggs with a shell thick enough. That's a problem that birds have, calcium carbonate. Think about it. So birds made it with these eggs, and they only need to find water to drink every once in a while, but they minimize losing water through their bodies, and they gave enough water to their babies in this amniotic egg. And finally, kind of from the reptiles you get the birds, and from the reptiles you also get the mammals. So we all have our reptile ancestor there. And our mammals, where do we live? We live pretty much in the land for the most part, and we figure out how to not lose water. Our skin is pretty much waterproof, also has a slight amount of keratin, but we are pretty much waterproof. If we need to lose water, we have sweat glands. A lot of organisms do not have sweat glands, so they don't lose water that way. We put our lungs inside also. That reduces evaporation of water during exchange of gases. But the most perfect adaptation is our amniotic egg. Instead of laying the egg outside, what do most of us do now? If you have an uterus, you keep it inside your uterus basically. And instead of a hard shell, you have your uterus there, but you still have the amnios. That's the little liquid that is surrounding the baby. That's what we call the amniotic fluid. And of course, that's the first thing that breaks when you go into labor. So, mammals, beautiful adaptations, ultimate protection to keep our embryos with the correct amount of water. And all these adaptations have basically allowed us to colonize almost all places on Earth, mainly for birds and mammals, because we are endotherms. And that means we can deal with any changes in the outside temperature. Reptiles and amphibians, remember they are still ectotherms, so they are limited in their distribution. So that brings us back to the end. You just have a whirlwind view of all the kingdoms with an emphasis on the adaptations. I hope when you go out now and you look at an egg or you look at a creature, you think of the basic questions. How are you dealing with the water problem? How are you dealing with your reproduction? When you look at plants, think, oh, look at that pollen. That's flying sperm. Great adaptation to move your reproductive cells from one place to another. So I hope this helps and gives you a good view of life. Enjoy it. Thank you.